You buy a home expecting peace, safety, and the chance to enjoy what you worked so hard for. But what happens when the very people meant to protect the neighborhood turn into your worst nightmare? Imagine stepping outside one morning and finding warning letters, threats, and strangers questioning whether you even belong in your own house. That's exactly what happened to me. And it spiraled far beyond petty fines and rules. Because when power goes unchecked, neighbors can become enemies. And the question is, how far will they go? When I first moved into the neighborhood, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for drama or power struggles or hidden rules designed to trip people up. All I wanted was peace. A quiet home by the lake where I could finally slow down, sip my morning coffee on the porch, and feel proud of what I had built for myself. The house itself wasn't extravagant. A cozy cabin with cedar siding, a small dock that stretched into the water, and enough space to breathe. After years of working long hours, saving every penny, this cabin felt like more than just a property. It felt like freedom. For the first time in a long time, I could hear birds in the morning instead of traffic. I could see water glistening through the trees instead of the glow of neon signs. The community seemed welcoming at first. The neighbors smiled, waved, and offered the usual polite small talk. The Homeowners Association, on paper, was supposed to protect property values and ensure the neighborhood stayed safe and beautiful. To me, that sounded harmless enough. After all, what's the harm in a little organization, a little structure to keep things orderly? I figured the HOA would take care of the common areas, keep the road maintained, and maybe send out a newsletter once in a while. For the first few months, life was everything I had hoped it would be. I spent weekends sanding the deck, planting wildflowers along the driveway, and finally finishing the little projects I'd been dreaming about. My neighbors seemed content to let me be, and I felt like I had found the perfect place to settle down. But even in those early days, there were small cracks that I didn't fully notice. Comments that seemed offhand at the time, but in hindsight, were more like warnings. A neighbor mentioned that the board likes things done a certain way. Another chuckled when I painted my shutters, muttering something about waiting to see if they let that slide. I brushed it off, convinced that as long as I paid my dues and kept my property neat, I had nothing to worry about. What I didn't realize then was that in this neighborhood, the rules weren't about fairness. They weren't about safety or beauty. They were about control. And the people who ran the HOA, especially one woman in particular, thrived on that control. To them, every new homeowner was someone to test, someone to push, someone to remind who was really in charge. At first, the signs of trouble were subtle. A letter in the mailbox reminding me that all exterior modifications require approval. A note tucked under my doormat suggested that lawn ornaments should be kept to a minimum. None of it seemed serious, just a little overzealous maybe, but it was more than that. These were the opening moves in a game I hadn't agreed to play, because while I thought I had bought a home to enjoy in peace, the HOA saw it differently. To them, I had stepped onto their turf, and it was only a matter of time before they made that clear. It didn't take long for the letters to multiply. At first, they were annoyances, one-page reminders with official-looking HOA letterheads, but soon the tone shifted. The first real strike came when I installed a small garden bed near the porch. Nothing extravagant, just a raised box with herbs and flowers. Within a week, I found an envelope taped to my front door. It read, "Unapproved landscaping installation. Remove immediately or face fines of $100 per week." I remember standing there, letter in hand, staring at the box of basil and marigolds like it was a crime scene. Herbs, flowers. That was the big violation. I called the HOA office to ask what was wrong, and that's when I heard her voice for the first time. Karen. She introduced herself as the head of the Architectural Review Committee, which sounded far more important than it actually was. She spoke with the kind of clipped authority that made it clear she wasn't interested in conversation. Her message was simple. You didn't get approval. Rules are rules. I tried to reason with her, explaining that I hadn't changed the structure of the house, just added a garden bed. But she cut me off, repeating the phrase like a chant. Rules are rules. It wasn't about flowers. It was about power. The second strike came only weeks later. I had left my kayak tied up at the dock overnight, something neighbors had been doing for years. But apparently I had broken another unwritten rule. This time the letter warned of unauthorized storage of watercraft, with a demand to pay a $200 fine. When I asked other neighbors about it, they shrugged. They never bothered us about it, one said. Another whispered that Karen had it out for new people. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA. I was being targeted. Things escalated quickly. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange sticker plastered to my front door. Violation notice, immediate. Action required. My crime? Apparently, the paint on my shutters was not within approved color guidelines. The kicker? I had chosen a shade of forest green that matched at least 3 other houses in the neighborhood. But when I brought this up, Karen brushed it aside, claiming those homes had been grandfathered in. The fines piled up. $50 here, $100 there. Each letter felt less like a notice and more like a threat. And with each passing week, I felt the walls closing in. What had started as small annoyances was turning into financial warfare. But it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about humiliation. One Saturday, as I was fixing a loose board on my deck, Karen showed up in person. No warning, no courtesy. Just marching right onto my property as though she owned it. She stood there with a clipboard, jotting notes as she eyed every corner of my cabin. This railing, she said sharply, not up to code. You'll need to replace it. I told her I'd already had it inspected when I bought the place, but she shook her head. Not according to our standards? That was the first time I felt real anger rise in my chest. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about community. This was about one person exerting control, one petty rule at a time. I asked her politely to leave my property, and for a moment she just stood there, staring, like she couldn't believe someone had dared to tell her no. Finally, she turned and walked off, muttering something about non-compliance being referred to the board. I had no idea what that meant, but I would soon find out. The following week, I received a certified letter. The HOA was threatening to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the growing stack of fines. That was the breaking point. I wasn't going to be bullied in my own home. I began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every interaction. I took photos of my garden, my shutters, and my deck. I spoke with neighbors who whispered their own stories of harassment, though most were too afraid to challenge the board directly. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was bending them, twisting them, inventing them as she went. And the board, they either turned a blind eye or secretly enjoyed watching her wage her little war. But the thing about bullies is that they never know when to stop. And Karen, she pushed one step too far. It happened on a rainy evening. I had just settled in when I heard a noise at the door. Not a knock, not a polite ring, but the sound of someone fumbling with the handle. I froze, and then the door swung open. Karen, standing in my living room. No invitation, no permission, dripping rain onto the floor as she held up her clipboard like a badge of authority. I need to inspect the interior for safety compliance, she snapped. I couldn't believe it. She had just walked in, unannounced, into my home. That's when I told her, in no uncertain terms, to leave immediately, that she had no right, no authority, no legal standing to be in my cabin. But she stood her ground, insisting she had board approval to conduct inspections, and just as my anger reached its boiling point, there was another voice, deep, calm, firm. Actually, I think you should explain that to me. Karen froze. Her eyes darted to the far side of the room, where someone had just stood up from the couch. It wasn't just anyone. It was the State Attorney General. Karen froze. Her clipboard slipped slightly in her hand, her eyes darting toward the figure, standing in my living room. It was the State Attorney General himself, calm, deliberate, and unmistakably authoritative. For the first time since this nightmare began, Karen looked rattled. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The Attorney General stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a storm. He glanced at me, then at Karen, and said in a voice that cut through the tension, "Would you like to explain why you just forced entry into a private residence?" Karen stammered, her bravado evaporating. I'm conducting an inspection. I have board approval." But before she could finish, he raised a hand. Not aggressive, not loud, but commanding enough to silence her instantly. "Let me be clear," he said. "You are trespassing. You have no legal right to enter this property without the homeowner's consent, and you just did so in front of a witness, me." The color drained from her face. In that moment, everything shifted. For weeks, she had walked around this neighborhood like a self-appointed dictator, barking orders, issuing fines, and twisting rules to suit her ego. But now, standing in my cabin, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Her voice trembled as she tried to backpedal. I didn't mean, this is a misunderstanding." But the Attorney General didn't let her off the hook. "A misunderstanding is when you misplace paperwork," he said evenly. "What you just did is an abuse of authority. You violated the law, you violated this homeowner's rights, and you've exposed your entire association to liability." Every word landed like a hammer. I stood there, silent, my heart pounding. For the first time, I wasn't the one under pressure. She was. Karen turned toward me, her expression a mixture of panic and rage. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You don't know how this works." But her words fell flat. The Attorney General didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and began writing. Slowly, methodically. The sound of his pen scratching across the page was louder than the rain outside. Karen tried to peek at what he was writing, but he angled the notebook away. Finally, he looked up and said, "You'll be hearing from my office soon, and I strongly suggest you inform your board to prepare legal counsel." Her jaw dropped. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're the HOA. We have authority." That was the last straw. The Attorney General's eyes hardened. "No," he said firmly. "You have responsibilities, and from what I've just witnessed, you've failed them completely." For a moment, the room was dead silent. The only sound was the storm outside, rain hammering against the windows as if nature itself was pounding on the walls. And then, with a final glare, Karen spun on her heel and stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind her. But her escape didn't matter. The damage was already done, because in that moment she had revealed her true self, not just to me, but to someone who had the power to hold her accountable. The confrontation didn't end there. News of the incident spread through the neighborhood, like wildfire. Word traveled fast in a community where gossip thrived, and soon everyone knew what had happened. The infamous Karen, caught trespassing, humiliated in front of the highest legal authority in the state. Some neighbors pretended they hadn't seen it coming. Others quietly admitted they'd been waiting for this day for years. One man down the street told me, almost gleefully, that Karen had been harassing him for leaving his trash can out too long. And now, finally, someone had put her in her place. But for me, the real turning point came days later, when I received a formal notice in the mail. Not from the HOA this time, but from the Attorney General's office. It was an official record of the complaint he had filed against the association, citing Karen's unlawful entry and the board's failure to rein in her behavior. The letter was written in the kind of precise legal language that left no room for doubt. The HOA was in serious trouble, and suddenly, the balance of power had shifted. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. Normally, Karen strutted into those gatherings like a queen addressing her subjects. But that night, she looked smaller, diminished, her shoulders hunched as whispers rippled through the room. The Attorney General hadn't needed to attend in person. His letter had been enough. Copies had circulated among the homeowners, and the outrage was boiling over. For the first time, people who had been silent, too afraid to speak up before, began voicing their grievances. One woman demanded to know why her son's basketball hoop had been removed from their driveway. Another shouted about unfair fines for grass-length violations. A man in the back slammed his fist on the table, recounting how Karen had threatened to tow his truck for being parked too close to the curb. The room erupted into chaos, and there was Karen, sitting at the head of the table, drowning in a tidal wave of anger she couldn't control. Her face turned red as she tried to regain order, shouting about bylaws and authority. But the louder she got, the less anyone listened. Finally, one homeowner stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "You don't run this neighborhood anymore." "We do." The applause that followed shook the walls. Karen sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was finished. As I watched the meeting unravel, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about the garden, the kayak, or the shutters. It was about years of abuse. Years of control, years of neighbors living under the shadow of someone who had forgotten that rules are meant to serve people, not the other way around. And now, in one dramatic moment, the curtain had been pulled back. Everyone could see Karen for who she really was. The climax of this battle wasn't just her humiliation. It was the collective awakening of an entire community. For the first time, the homeowners weren't scared of her. They were united. And Karen? She had nowhere left to run. The meeting ended in chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that carried a sense of freedom. For years, homeowners had walked into those meetings with their heads down, too afraid to speak out, too afraid of what Karen or the board might do next. But that night, everything changed. Karen stormed out midway through the shouting, her face flushed with fury, her stack of violation notices still clutched in her hands like weapons she no longer had the strength to use. She didn't slam the door this time. She just left, quietly, and somehow that silence was louder than anything she could have shouted. In the days that followed, the community transformed. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another began knocking on doors, sharing stories, comparing their own experiences of harassment. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone. And once that silence was broken, the floodgates opened. I heard stories that chilled me. One man told me Karen had once threatened to sue him because his dog's bark disrupted the peace during daytime hours. Another family admitted they'd been paying hundreds in fines every year because their children's toys were visible from the street. People had been bullied into compliance, one household at a time, convinced that they had no choice but to obey. But now the tide had turned. The official notice from the Attorney General's office struck like a lightning bolt. The investigation wasn't just about Karen trespassing into my cabin, it was about the board's entire pattern of abuse. They demanded documentation of every fine issued in the past 5 years, every complaint, every alleged rule that had been enforced. And as those files were dragged into the light, the truth became undeniable. The HOA had been operating less like a governing body and more like Karen's personal kingdom. Rules were applied inconsistently, selectively, and almost always in ways that gave her more control. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear were now testifying openly. Affidavits piled up. Some even volunteered to appear in court if necessary. The Attorney General's office didn't just see a petty neighborhood squabble. They saw a case study in what happens when unchecked authority festers. Karen tried to fight back, of course. She doubled down at first, sending out frantic newsletters defending her leadership and painting herself as the victim of an unfair smear campaign. She even attempted to call an emergency meeting to strip me of community privileges for allegedly inciting hostility, but it was too late. Nobody showed up to her meeting. The same people who once feared her had stopped listening. Within 3 months, the board was forced to hold a recall vote, and this time the room wasn't filled with silence or fear. It was filled with voices, strong, determined, and ready for change. When the ballots were counted, the result was decisive. Karen and her closest allies on the board were removed from power. For the first time in years, homeowners actually cheered at the outcome of an HOA meeting. Karen left the neighborhood not long after. Rumor had it she put her house up for sale, quietly, avoiding interactions with anyone, slipping away without so much as a goodbye. And maybe that was the greatest irony of all. The woman who once acted like she owned the community could no longer stand to live in it. But the resolution wasn't just about her leaving. It was about what came after. The new board, made up of regular homeowners who had endured the same harassment as the rest of us, immediately began dismantling the absurd rules Karen had enforced. Gone were the fines for harmless lawn ornaments. Gone were the threats over kayaks at the dock or shutters painted the wrong shade of green. For the first time, the HOA was actually serving its purpose, maintaining the neighborhood, not micromanaging lives. The road was repaved, the common dock repaired, and for once, dues were used for the benefit of everyone, not Karen's crusades. It was like the neighborhood had taken a deep breath after years of suffocation. For me personally, the resolution was more than just relief. It was vindication. I still remember standing on that deck one evening, the same one Karen had once called non-compliant, watching the sun set over the lake. The water was calm, the air crisp, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like my home was truly mine again. The garden I had planted was thriving. Basil, mint, marigolds, all the little pieces of peace I had once been fined for. Every leaf felt like a small victory. But more than that, I felt connected to my neighbors in a way I hadn't before. We weren't just people living on the same street anymore. We had been through a battle together, and in the process, we had reclaimed not just our homes, but our dignity. Of course, the story didn't end without consequences. Karen's name became a cautionary tale in the world of HOA management. The Attorney General's office used her case as an example in training materials, reminding boards across the state that authority is not a blank check. Some say she tried to join another HOA board in a different community, but word spread quickly, and she was denied. As for the rest of us, the impact was lasting. People who had once dreaded HOA meetings began to attend them eagerly, not out of fear, but out of a genuine interest in shaping the future of their neighborhood. Rules were rewritten with clarity and fairness in mind. Disputes were handled with transparency. And maybe most importantly, nobody lived in fear of a clipboard anymore. Looking back, I often think about how small it all seemed at first. A garden bed, a kayak, shutters painted green, harmless, ordinary things that spiraled into something far darker. It makes you realize how easily power can corrupt when it goes unchecked, and how quickly a community can turn toxic if nobody stands up. But it also taught me something else, that one act of defiance, one refusal to be bullied, can spark a chain reaction. If Karen hadn't overstepped that night, if she hadn't barged into my cabin drunk on her own authority, maybe the community would still be living in fear. Sometimes, the worst actions of an antagonist create the very downfall they never saw coming. And that brings me to the takeaway, the lesson hidden beneath all the drama. Homeowners associations, neighbors, communities. They're supposed to make life better. They're supposed to create unity, protect value, and foster pride in where we live. But when power becomes the goal instead of service, when rules are weaponized instead of applied fairly, what you get isn't community, it's control. And here's the truth. People will only live under control for so long before they push back. In my case, it took an attorney general standing in my living room to tip the scales, but it didn't have to be that way. If more of us had spoken up sooner, maybe Karen wouldn't have gotten so bold, so reckless. So here's my question for you. How many of us are staying silent right now, in our own neighborhoods, in our own lives, letting small abuses slide because they feel too petty to fight? And at what point does silence turn into surrender?